Welcome to the History Unplugged podcast, the unscripted show that celebrates unsung heroes, myth-busts historical lies, and rediscovers the forgotten stories that changed our world. I'm your host, Scott Rank. If you were a middle school student in the United States sometime between the mid-'80s and the mid-'90s and you were bored in your computer lab, there's a very good chance you played Oregon Trail. It was a very simple game where you would load up your wagon, you would get supplies that you needed, you would hunt buffalo and squirrels along the way, and the way that you would hunt was basically to spin around in a circle and shoot your gun, which, for those of you who don't hunt, that's not a safe way to do that. You would try to ford rivers, but typically you would die along the way of starvation, or you would get a message that would pop up that would famously say, "You have died of dysentery." The Oregon Trail took off at a time of America's worst economic slump that it saw until the Great Depression. After President Andrew Jackson and during the presidencies of William Henry Harrison and others, many people could no longer afford to stay where they were on the East Coast, and the financial urgency and also a sense of destiny, manifest destiny specifically, drove them west. Many Americans wanted to physically occupy the West as a physical bulwark against outside intervention from the English, from the Russians, and others. So tens of thousands of Americans trekked over 2,000 miles from Missouri's western edge in Independence to Oregon country, and this path was known as the Oregon Trail. In this episode, I'm going to be talking with history professor Greg Jackson, who's the host of the History That Doesn't Suck podcast, about the Oregon Trail, and get down to the details of what it looked like to travel on it. How can families cross the desert? How did they cross the Rocky Mountains? How did they descend the Columbia River? We'll hear about fur traders, missionaries, explorers, and early wagon trains that blazed the trail before its heyday of the 1840s and 1860s. We'll also learn about people who wrote faulty guidebooks on how to travel the Oregon and California trails and led to disasters like the Donner Party expedition. Finally, we'll learn about whether or not people died of dysentery in the numbers that the video game would suggest. I hope you enjoy this episode. Greg, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Scott. Glad to join you.
Well, here is the absolute best place to start a podcast interview, and that is with dysentery. So, the Oregon Trail. When you mention Oregon Trail, if you are of a certain age and you went to middle school at a certain time and went to a computer lab sometime between 1989 and the mid-90s, you played Oregon Trail on Apple IIe or whatever the computer was at the time. And what everyone remembers from that is the line, "You have died of dysentery." There's t-shirts you can buy of it off of Cafe Press. So that's the thing that comes to people's mind, the phrase, "You have died of dysentery" when we talk of Oregon Trail. Before we actually get into the history of the Oregon Trail, the legacies of the Oregon Trail, let's get right to the root matter and not put it off any longer. So how likely were you to actually die of dysentery on the real Oregon Trail?
Not nearly as likely as you are when you play that touchstone game of my childhood. There's about a 5% death rate when we average out the deaths in all the wagon parties heading across the Oregon Trail. So, I mean, that's a pretty high rate in and of itself, right? I don't know if I'd want to go on a trip if I were told, 1 in 20 of you are going to die. But that said, those deaths are certainly not all dysentery. There's so many other fun ways to get killed, Scott. You can drown in the river. That happens plenty. While you're fording or foolishly trying to swim. Gun accidents happen. People get stampeded by the herds of buffalo that do still exist early on. Good old-fashioned illness, ingesting something that you shouldn't have, and just having a lack of, medical attention out there. So, yeah, dysentery's on the list, but plenty of other opportunities.
Right. I don't know if the game gave me a warped sense of the Oregon Trail. Dysentery got me, fording the river got me, and I think that game also gave people a very warped sense of what hunting was to city slickers, where
it's so easy, right?
You just spin around in a circle and fire your gun, which is a very safe way to hunt, of course. So,
yeah, best practices right there. By the way, I have to tell you, as you mentioned the shirt, which is awesome. One of my good friends, someone who works on my podcast with me, CL, on History That Doesn't Suck. She was at a party once, and someone was wearing a "You Have Died of Dysentery" T-shirt. She said what a great shirt it was, and of course made some sort of joke alluding to the game. The person wearing it had no clue. Totally didn't get it. Was just being ironic, thought it was a fun shirt when they saw it online or whatever. Had no idea what it was from.
Too bad. Well, we're going to fix that here. And also, we're going to give you time to typhoid, cholera, smallpox, so many other diseases out there. Malaria, well, I guess that's too far north. Let's go back to the beginning. And I think for what a lot of people who are listening to this episode, it will do is, although they have passing familiarity with the Oregon Trail, provide a lot of nuance. I don't know if I would say a revisionist account, but fill in many of the blanks and add some different shades to it. Let's start off with the consolidation, and this is the early expansion of the United States. What causes the trail to the Oregon Territory to consolidate, and why is this a destination for settlement in early America?
Excellent question. So let's kind of take that in two parts. So let's start off on how it even really turns into a trail to begin with, which will also inform the why. We start off with fur traders and missionaries, essentially. I mean, Europeans first made their way around the continent and made contact via ship, named the Columbia River and all that jazz, both the British and the Americans. And that's part of where, and we should note this, Oregon country is claimed by both the UK and the United States. So it's a disputed territory. Really, nothing much is happening there in terms of Europeans and European Americans until we get into the early 1800s. There's a New Yorker named John Jacob Astor who is ridiculously wealthy, just obscenely wealthy. And he decides to start investing in the fur trade. So in 1808, he sets up the Pacific Fur Company, and they're going to set up a fort in Oregon country, which they do in 1811. And they start to have some success. Again, our buddy John here is a successful businessman back in New York. He knows how to make things happen. Of course, he's not going there personally, right? I mean, he's the suit behind it. He's investing. He's not about to leave New York for the rugged terrain of Oregon country. But the War of 1812 basically puts the kibosh on this whole venture. It dies out. And as his guys are trying to make their way back to the United States, because, it might be the U.S. today, but we got to remember, we're talking about Oregon country in the early 1800s. This is not the United States. It's just disputed territory. They stumble upon a point where the Rockies actually flatten out quite a bit, and you can basically walk through them. And this will later become known as the South Pass. It's in Wyoming, or what will become Wyoming. And this is a huge game changer because up to this point, it's been perceived that the continental, why am I blanking on the term? Continental divide, yeah?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. We established it's early here where I'm at. So these Rocky Mountains that jet between what's today the United States, right near where I'm at, up into Canada, it's seen as impassable. So to find the South Pass, this is really opening the option, the idea that normal people beyond just fur traders could even make this overland route. So, fast forward a little bit, the British continue to descend upon the area. The Hudson Bay Company is really involved with furs. But then by the time we get into the 1830s or so, we have American missionaries that are coming to the area. And it's really funny how this happens. At one point, a few Indians from Oregon country make their way to the United States. They head out to St. Louis. And it is reported in a newspaper that one of them complains of not having the Bible, which they call the white man's book of heaven. Now, this is a very doubtful narrative. I mean, we know that they did show up, but there was probably a lot of exaggeration. At least maybe I'm putting too many words into the primary sources. I get the sense, as do many other historians, that there was a lot of exaggeration here. But once that starts showing up in the newspapers, some Christian missionary organizations in the United States, they basically see this as the indigenous peoples of what is Oregon country saying they want Jesus. So we get some missionaries like Dr. Marcus Whitman, who excitedly head out, start establishing missions, bringing more missionaries. He marries a missionary, Narcissa, and brings his wife out there. And as she's traveling, she makes it sound like it's super easy to make this trip. She writes this letter in which she says the Oregon Trail is a smoother and easier go than turnpikes in the United States. Little bit of hyperbole, just a titch. But all these factors start lining up to where Americans are going, okay, so the Rockies that seemed utterly impassable are in fact passable thanks to the South Pass. Missionaries are going to and fro, and it's a big deal when Narcissa and other white women are making it through and into Oregon country, because this changes the perception in 19th century America, which has certainly a stronger patriarchal view than we do in the 21st century. It was very much thought that there's no way a white woman could make the trip before this. So to have Narcissa writing these letters saying, oh yeah, this is chill, this is awesome. She worded it slightly differently. She didn't quite say chill. But
in the freezing to death sense, it very well could be, but not the way she intended.
Yeah, with those late starts, like the Donner Party, or rather delays on their part. But this is what sets up the trail to being, something that's accessible. People start going, okay, I can actually take my family there. I can load up a wagon and we can head out. This is possible. Now, that doesn't happen until the 1840s, but that groundwork had been laid for decades by the fur traders and then the missionaries.
The same kind of marketing psychology, I think of a Amway salesman or some type of multi-level marketing where it vastly exaggerates what could happen and vastly underplays the challenges to it. And I really want to get into the mindset. Exactly. And I want to get into the psychology of those who went. Before we do, one other thing too, when you were talking about it being disputed territory, now it's always a mistake to talk about the American frontier as if there's no one there. Of course, there's indigenous groups there. The Lewis and Clark Party find that some of the American Indians know scattered bits of English from encounters with English sailors. And is there much of a Russian presence in Oregon at this time as well when we get closer to the coasts?
Oregon, the Russians do have interest out there, as you know. Alaska is Russian at this point, and they have made some efforts at controlling land as far down as California. They don't have a huge footprint, though. It's really not a factor in any meaningful way. The real throwdown for the turf is between the British and the United States. But you're right that we shouldn't forget that Russia is a part of this expanding attempt to kind of just gobble up territory across North America. And that it is felt all the way down into, what is at that point, well, before 1821, Spanish territory when we get into California, and then Mexican territory after that. But yeah, I can't say I have too many awesome, cool Russian stories to tell you. Nothing that's going to rival, say, a Rocky movie, unfortunately.
All right. Well, we're going to get into the kind of Ivan Drago-esque battle in the game of Manifest Destiny.
That we are.
Well, actually, that's what I'm curious about, because in some senses, when you hear about the story of Manifest Destiny, it does sound like Rocky IV, where that's the spirit of people who want to go out west, where I am a soldier of the Monroe Doctrine, and I, as an American, am going to embody this place in the West so that no sneaky Englishman or Frenchman or Ruski is going to come out and take this land. I'm going to hold it for Uncle Sam, who doesn't exist at this time as a patriotic figure. But I'd like to know, what is the motivation for someone